A repeated cycle of arrival, collapse, and replacement, playing out again and again in the same limestone cave. Over tens of thousands of years, each new wave of people largely unaware that they were settling into a landscape already littered with the genetic dead ends of failed predecessors. Bas Bacho Kiro isn't even the only site from this exact same critical window in history to reveal this same unsettling pattern. And understanding the wider picture makes the story even more dramatic. A separate 2021 study, published by researchers led by Kay Proofer in the journal Nature, analyzed the genome of a woman whose skull was discovered at a site called Zlatý Kus in the Czech Republic. Archaeologists studying her remains have identified her as one of the very first women known to have reached Europe. Her genetic line, too, died out completely, leaving no detectable descendants among any population living today anywhere on Earth. Meanwhile, at yet another site, a roughly 40,000-year-old man discovered in Romania, known to researchers as OACE-1, tells an almost identical story of genetic failure. Both the OACE-1 lineage from Romania and the Ust-Ishim lineage from a roughly 45,000-year-old man discovered in Siberia appear to have died out entirely as well. Notably, OACE-1 carried an even larger Neanderthal genetics legacy than the Bacho Kiro individuals, and researchers determined the chunks of Neanderthal DNA in his genome came from mixing that occurred only around 4 to 6 generations before his own birth. An interbreeding event distinct from, and separate to, whatever happened in the ancestry of the Bulgarian cave dwellers. Haaretz, plus 3, stack all of these findings together, from Bulgaria, from Romania, from the Czech Republic, from Siberia, and a genuinely startling pattern of near-total failure emerges from Europe's earliest chapter of modern human settlement. Writing up their conclusions, Hajdinjak and her research team stated plainly, in conclusion, the Bacho Kiro cave genomes show that several distinct modern human populations existed during the early Upper Paleolithic in Eurasia. Multiple separate, genetically distinct pioneer populations, each independently pushing into a hostile, Neanderthal-occupied Ice Age landscape, and the vast majority of them simply failed to establish any lasting genetic foothold at all. The lines represented by OACE-1 in Romania and Ust-Ishim in Siberia appear to have died out completely. The earlier Bulgarian cave people from Bacho Kiro managed a partial survival, but only in Asia and eastern regions, further afield. Their genetic signal essentially absent from Western Europe entirely. Haaretz. What we're looking at, in other words, is a genuine repeated pattern of failed colonization attempts, one after another, scattered across an entire continent, each one a full population of real, living, breathing human beings who successfully crossed into an unfamiliar territory, built tools, crafted jewelry, interbred with an entirely different species of human already living there, and then, within a matter of thousands of years, were simply gone. Their bloodlines snuffed out so completely that if their bones hadn't happened to survive in exactly the right cave, under exactly the right preservation conditions, for exactly the right archaeologist to eventually dig them up tens of thousands of years later, we would have absolutely no idea they had ever existed at all. There's an important scientific nuance buried underneath this whole dramatic story, one worth being honest about rather than overselling for the sake of a punchier headline. These vanished populations weren't a separate species of human being, in the strict biological sense researchers reserve for something like Neanderthals or Denisovans. They were fully modern Homo sapiens, genetically human in every meaningful sense, capable of interbreeding freely with every other human population they encountered, including the Neanderthals living alongside them. What makes their story so genuinely strange isn't that they belong to some entirely separate branch of the human family tree. It's that an entire distinct lineage, an entire genetically identifiable branch of our own species, one that pioneered European settlement, mixed intimately with Neanderthals, and successfully spread its genes as far as East Asia and eventually the Americas, still somehow failed to leave any lasting trace in the exact region where its own remains happen to have been preserved and discovered. It's less the story of an alien species vanishing, and more the story of an entire, successful, adaptable, far-traveling branch of humanity quietly losing its foothold in one specific corner of the world, its survival balanced instead entirely on descendants who happen to keep moving east into territory we now recognize in the ancestry of modern East Asians and Native Americans. One assessment of what the Bacho Kiro discovery ultimately represents. Put it this way, genetically, these individuals offer an important early snapshot, their genomes preserving traces of interactions and movements that predate many of the demographic events that later formed the genetic tapestry of Europe as we know it today. Yet the link between these late Pleistocene pioneers and modern Bulgarians, or any other modern Europeans, remains indirect at best. Successive waves of migration, local extinctions, And further admixture across the tens of thousands of years since mean that the Bachokiro groups contributed meaningfully to Europe's deep ancestral history, but are highly unlikely to be the sole or even the primary direct ancestors of any single modern population living in Europe today. Denagenics. That last point deserves real emphasis because it reshapes how we should think about European ancestry in general, not just this one specific cave in Bulgaria. Most people, without ever really examining the assumption closely, tend to picture their own ancestry as a single, continuous, unbroken thread, stretching back in an orderly line from themselves, to their grandparents, to increasingly distant and shadowy ancestors, eventually connecting all the way back to whoever the very first humans were to settle wherever their family happens to be from today. The truth, at least according to what these Bulgarian, Romanian, and Czech genomes reveal, is considerably messier and honestly far more interesting than that simple, tidy family tree most of us carry around in our heads. Europe's actual population history looks less like a single river flowing continuously from source to sea, and more like a series of separate, often unsuccessful expeditions, waves of pioneering humans pushing into unfamiliar, dangerous Ice Age territory, mixing intimately with an entirely separate species of human being already living there, and then, more often than not, simply failing, their genetic legacy either vanishing entirely or surviving only by accident thousands of miles away, in populations who never even set foot in the exact caves where their own distant ancestors had once carved jewelry out of animal teeth and laid their dead to rest. Bachokiro Cave, in the end, isn't really a story about one single lost species of human being, vanishing mysteriously into the mists of prehistory the way that framing might initially suggest. It's something stranger, and, in its own way, more haunting, proof that the very first successful human colonizers of an entire continent can leave behind astonishingly detailed physical evidence of their own existence, elaborate tools, carved ornaments, and even direct genetic proof of intimate relationships with an entirely different kind of human being, and still, ultimately, fail to become anyone's ancestor in the one place they actually called home. Their real descendants, if you trace the DNA honestly all the way through to today, aren't necessarily the people living in Bulgaria's Balkan mountains right now. They're scattered instead across East Asia, and further still, across the Americas, carrying forward, entirely unknowingly, the genetic legacy of a small, forgotten band of Ice Age pioneers who once lit fires and carved jewelry deep inside a Bulgarian cave, tens of thousands of years before either continent had a name. The two other genetic dead ends mentioned alongside Bachokiro deserve their own moment in this story, because the way their bones were actually found is almost as remarkable as what their DNA eventually revealed. Take the Romanian case first. In February of 2002, a group of amateur cavers belonging to a Timișoara-based exploration club called Pro Aqua Group were mapping an unexplored cave system near the town of Anina in the southwestern Carpathian Mountains. Climbing a 30-meter-tall vertical pit, the group found themselves facing a stretch of wide, unexplored galleries. Following the passage to its end, they discovered a mouse hole opening, just wide enough to feel a draft of cool, fresh air passing through it, a telltale sign that more cave lay hidden on the other side. Excavating a passage barely large enough for one person to crawl through, the cavers broke into an entirely new set of galleries, over 10 meters in diameter, littered with the bones of long-dead bears, goats, wolves, and other animals. Those galleries had been sealed off, cut off from the outside world for at least 17,000 years, and lying right there on the surface, at the intersection of the main upper galleries and a side passage, was a complete, remarkably well-preserved lower human jawbone. The cavers had the good sense to recognize this might be important, and contacted Oana Moldovan, director of Romania's oldest cave research institute, who in turn brought in Eric Trinkhaus, a leading specialist in human evolution. Trinkhaus met the discovery team in Europe in May of 2002, and direct radiocarbon dating on the jawbone itself eventually placed its age at somewhere between roughly 34 and 36,000 years old, a combined calibrated age of around $40 for 140 years, making it, at the time, the oldest directly dated modern human fossil ever found in Europe. The following year, in June of 2003, the same team of cavers and researchers returned to properly map the cave and in the process uncovered even more of the same individual, a facial skeleton, a temporal bone, and additional cranial fragments, all apparently belonging to the same person, now known to science simply as Oase 1. What made Oase 1's jawbone so scientifically electrifying wasn't just its age, it was its shape. The mandible presents an unusual, genuinely striking mosaic of both modern and unmistakably archaic features, a prominent chin structure typical of modern humans, sitting right alongside an exceptionally wide ramus, and unusually large molars, traits far more characteristic of Neanderthals than of Homo sapiens. That strange mixture of features led researchers to a direct hypothesis that this individual carried recent Neanderthal ancestry, visible not just statistically in his DNA, but physically stamped into the actual architecture of his own skull. Later, genetic testing confirmed exactly that suspicion, revealing substantial Neanderthal ancestry running through OASE-1's genome, inherited, as later research would show, from a Neanderthal ancestor only 4 to 6 generations back, an interbreeding event entirely separate from, and apparently unrelated to, whatever happened generations earlier in the ancestry of the Bulgarian cave dwellers at Bachokiro. In 2009, forensic facial reconstruction specialist Richard Neve used the recovered bone fragments to physically reconstruct what this individual's face may have actually looked like, giving a concrete, almost startlingly human face to the very first confirmed Homo sapiens known to have lived on Romanian soil more than 35,000 years ago. A face that, in the end, turned out to have no living descendants anywhere on Earth today. The Czech discovery has an even stranger origin story precisely because nobody involved at the time had any idea what they'd actually found. Back in 1950, workers exploring the Konyaprusy caves in central Bohemia came across a partial human skeleton, later given the name Zlatý kůň, meaning golden horse in Czech, after the hill under which the cave system sits. For decades, this skeleton sat in storage, studied here and there by anthropologists, but without any way to actually determine its true age or genetic significance, since the technology to properly analyze ancient DNA at this level simply didn't exist yet. It would take nearly 70 years, and the tools of modern genetic sequencing, before anyone realized exactly what had been sitting quietly in a museum collection in Prague the entire time. The remains of one of the very earliest modern humans ever to reach Europe, a woman who lived and died roughly 45,000 years ago, making her genome, once finally sequenced, one of the oldest modern human genomes ever recovered anywhere in the world. Researchers eventually used CT scans of her reconstructed 9-piece skull, taken in 2018, to digitally approximate what she may have actually looked like in life more than 70 years after her bones were first pulled out of the ground. The resulting reconstruction shows a woman with dark, curled hair, light brown skin, and brown eyes set into a strong, proportionally wide face. Even small forensic details survived on her actual bones. Researchers noted her skull is missing sections of the nasal bone, part of the upper jaw, the left eye socket, and part of the left side of the forehead. And one particularly striking detail emerged from that same analysis. Part of her skull had clearly been gnawed by an animal sometime after her death, quite possibly a wolf or a hyena, both of which are known to have been present in the local fauna during that exact period of prehistory. A small, visceral detail reminding you that this wasn't some abstract genetic data point, but the actual physical remains of a real woman, left exposed long enough after her death for a scavenging predator to find and gnaw at her skull, tens of thousands of years before anyone would ever excavate her, sequence her, or attempt to reconstruct her face. Like the pioneers at Bachokiro and the man from Oase Cave in Romania, her genetic line, once fully sequenced, turned out to lead nowhere. No descendants detectable among any population living today, anywhere on the planet. 3 separate individuals, found in 3 separate countries, unearthed through 3 wildly different circumstances, a cave survey by dedicated Romanian speleologists, a chance find by Czech quarry workers, and a carefully planned scientific excavation in Bulgaria. And all 3 telling the exact same underlying story. Real people, fully modern in every genetic sense, who lived, mixed intimately with Neanderthals, and ultimately left absolutely nothing behind in the populations that came after them, their entire existence surviving only because their bones happened to end up in exactly the right cave, preserved for tens of thousands of years, waiting for science to finally learn how to listen to what they had left behind.